Good afternoon and good evening to everyone joining us today from different parts of the world. My name is Ria Ligari. I'm Community of Practice Consultant for the UN Women Training Center, and I'm very glad to welcome you all to this virtual dialogue webinar on men, masculinities, and training for gender equality. So on your screens today, you'll see an outline of today's webinar. So first, we will go through a few of the logistics, just so we can see how this webinar works and make sure that all of you can participate fully. And then I'll introduce our topic for today and today's panelists, who will each speak to us in turn. And finally, we'll have some questions from you posed as a Q&A session right at the end for our speakers. So that brings me on to the logistics. So please remember to send in your questions using the questions tab on the GoToWebinar toolbar at any time. So the black arrow is showing you now where you can write your questions, so please do keep sending those in. And I should also mention that this webinar is being recorded and it's going to be available on the UN Women Training Center's YouTube channel as soon as, well, later on today. And if you have any connectivity issues, we're not actually going to use the webcam feature today because we've had some connectivity issues already. But yeah, so hopefully everything will go fine today. And we can begin by introducing today's panelists. I'm very happy to welcome, we have with us today Jane Kato-Wallace, Program Director at Promundo-US, and Oswaldo Montoya, Global Networks Associate at MenEngage. And we were going to have with us Jean Nimubona of CARE International and the MenEngage Initiative in Burundi, but he hasn't been able to join us yet, so we're still waiting for him. I think he may have some technical issues. So before we begin, I'd just like to explain a little bit about what virtual dialogues are. So at the UN Women Training Center, we believe in creating and sharing learning in a participatory manner. And that's really the drive behind our virtual dialogues. So that makes them a mechanism for us as training practitioners to continually discuss, exchange, and share knowledge, and really nurture a community of learning across the world. So these virtual dialogues are part webinar, which is where we are today, and part forum discussion. And at the end of this session, I will explain to you all how to join the forum discussion so that you can keep debating this issue of masculinities and engaging men after the webinar has ended. And I should note that this is the first virtual dialogue that we've held in this year that's been hosted by the UN Women Training Center's Community of Practice, the COP. And the COP, as many of you will already know, is an open platform for dialogue and knowledge sharing for participants from different organizations from all over the world, government, civil society, academia, and UN agencies. And that brings us on for our topic today. So we're here to discuss a very important issue, which is masculinities. And I don't know if all of you know, but the UN Women Training Center has a new self-paced course on masculinities, which we hope many of you will sign up for. And as the course explains, what we understand by masculinities are the gendered roles, behaviors, and attributes that are associated with maleness and considered appropriate for men. But of course, there is no one understanding of what masculinities are. These are ever-changing, they vary between and even within historical contexts and cultures, and these ideas are shaped by historical and cultural processes of gender formation that distribute power and privilege unevenly. So when we speak about masculinities, we're often referring to patriarchal masculinities. We're referring to the very ideas that perpetuate harmful gender norms by emphasizing the supposed superiority of masculinity over femininity or the authority of men over women. But as the self-paced course, and I'm sure our speakers today will explain, there are alternatives to this very narrow understanding of patriarchal masculinities. And alternatives, for example, like transformative masculinities, which really emphasize the values of respect and dignity for all people of all gender identities. So that's really what we're here to discuss during this virtual dialogue today. And so the overall objective of this dialogue, right before I hand over to our first speaker, who I think will be Jane today, the overall objective that we're here to discuss is what do we mean by masculinities in training for gender equality? And more importantly, maybe, why are masculinities important to consider? And why is it so important to engage men in training for gender equality? And finally, how can we address masculinities and better engage men through training in order to advance transformative gender change? So to begin reflecting on these questions, we're now going to turn to our panelists' presentations. And please remember to use the questions tab to send in your questions to us at any time so that we can discuss these with our speakers at the end of the session. So I'm going to do just a little, okay. I'm going to give Jane, or can you hear me? I'm going to unmute Jane. Hi, Jane. Can you hear me? Hi. Okay. Okay. So I'm just going to give, I'm just going to give a tiny introduction. We're going to whiz through Jean's presentation because he's not here to give it. And we're going to go straight to Jane. And so Jane is, who is supposed to be our second speaker, but will now be our first, is Jane Kato-Wallace of Promundo-US. And Jane is an expert in program development, training, and research related to engaging men and boys. She's really been at the forefront of developing the Global Men Care campaign and training Promundo's international partners on implementing Program P, which is a gender transformative approach to engaging men as caregivers. And Jane, I'm going to give you keyboard and mouse control so that you can go through your presentation. And I'd like to give you the floor now, please.
Okay. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. It is a pleasure to be here with you all. I'm actually going to try and have my video cam on just for a second so you can see my face, just for, hi everybody, just so you can see my face and my space and what it looks like before I start. But I'm going to turn it off just so we can make sure that we don't have any issues with connectivity. But good morning, everyone, and many thanks to Ruya and others at the UN Women Training Center for this kind invitation to present on the men, masculinities, and training for gender equality. My name is Jane Kato-Wallace, and I'm the Director of Programs at Promundo and lead design many of the trainings that we do with partners on this topic of men and masculinities. All right, trying to click to the next slide. Let's see. Okay, so the main question I was asked to cover in my 5 minutes is to address how can we employ training for gender equality to navigate the complexities of engaging men in transforming the gender inequalities that currently privilege them. So in other words, how can we get men on board with gender equality, but still have them recognize and share their unearned power and privileges? What does that look like from a practical training perspective? So this is a very multi-layered and complex topic that I feel like we could spend an entire training onto itself covering, but let's see if we can answer this in a couple minutes. Okay. At the core of all of our trainings is the critical examination of power and privileges in many of its forms, but most specifically of gender privilege. One of the most challenging aspects of the training on men and masculinities is the tendency for organizations, to be quite frank, to depoliticize this work and make male engagement just about the sharing of roles and responsibilities. So for example, if men are taking on more of the housework or doing more caregiving and not necessarily sharing decision-making power between the home, without also measuring the level of agency that women experience, the levels of self-efficacy that women experience, well then our trainings or our programs are not going as far as we need them to go. Second, in addition, the discussion about power also has to be intersectional when talking about masculinity. So that includes an examination of the ways in which power is influenced by race, class, poverty, ableism, gender identity, and the list goes on. So we don't talk about, we don't talk only about patriarchal systems of power where men in general as a group have power over women as a group, but also the complexities in terms of how issues of these intersectional issues influence levels of power, not only between men and women, but between different groups of men and different groups of women. And we try to do this through fun and engaging exercises that allow participants to get up and move, role play. These are all really excellent approaches to get training participants to step into, quote unquote, the roles of others. I personally love the Patriarchy and the Power Walk by the Regional Learning Community for East and Southeast Asia. This was a group that was part of the Partners for Prevention study on men and masculinities in Asia that was conducted not too long ago. I highly recommend that training manual. Again, it's the Regional Learning Community for East and Southeast Asia. You can Google it, and there's lots of really excellent activities in there to really delve into this concept of power and privilege. Okay. Can I just click through? Yeah, okay. The second principle in our trainings is how to promote the empathetic connection between men and boys by provoking reflection on the restrictive norms around masculinity. So how limiting, suffocating, policing it can be and feel for men to be trapped in this, what we call the man box. How it limits not only men's expression of difficult or different kinds of feelings, but also human expression. And as social media, for example, grows all the more ubiquitous, the spaces where men's and women's behaviors in terms of being policed also continues to grow and maintain a very patriarchal order that privileges sort of dominant forms of masculinities over others. The truth is, though, and this is what we try to communicate in our trainings, is that most men cannot fit all of these hegemonic traits all of the time. And in trying to do so, they feel pressure all the times to fit into these boxes, which can lead to stress, violent expressions of entitlement when ideal manhood cannot be attained, suicide, risk-taking behaviors, and you all sort of know the other consequences. So including in your trainings a discussion and reflection on the costs of harmful masculinities and the benefits of redefining manhood is so critical and complementary to the first point, where we're examining men's power and privilege. An activity that I really like that helps to unpack the man box is actually called the Man Box, and Men's Resources International, I believe they have a different name now, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. Men's Resources International has an excellent activity on this, and Promundo's program HM&D Toolkit, we have an activity called Act Like a Man, Act Like a Woman, which helps to get to that as well. Okay. The third guideline is around gender equality and its benefits. Can often become some kind of abstract discussion and can be sort of this lifeless thing if we don't also include open and emotional sharing between participants, between men and women whom you're training. These kinds of trainings become all the more powerful when men and women can share personal stories that allow people to hear from others the lived reality of what it's like to be a man and a woman. Do not underestimate the power of human connection and empathy, and we would recommend to incorporate this sharing at every opportunity in your trainings. Activities that I like personally are kind of fishbowl activities where men are, for example, sitting in a circle and then women are sitting in an inner circle, and there's a facilitator in the inner circle asking women questions about when was the first time that they realized that they were a woman, what is one thing you want men to know about what it's like to be a woman. These are not new questions, but sometimes the format where women are allowed to space to speak about their experiences while men are sitting on the outside, kind of eyes open, ears open, mouths closed, can be a really, really revealing and often quite emotional activity. And then you would kind of switch the circles. So women would sit on the outside and men would kind of sit on the inside of the circle. So any opportunities to promote that empathetic listening and experience sharing so that men can also step into other people's shoes is excellent. And then finally, the last guideline that I would recommend on training with partners on men and masculinities has to do with incorporating a deep reflection and discussion on accountability to women's rights and other social justice movements. What does it mean to be accountable as an organization or as a program seeking to work with men and boys for gender equality? What do accountable practices look like? What are our principles as an organization, as professionals around issues of accountability? How do we ensure that we are working in concert with women's rights, feminist, social justice colleagues, and that such groups are on board with our approach, and if not, that we are open to that critique, to that criticism, and willing to revise our way of doing work in ways that are much more inclusive and holistic. And as part of that, I just want to put in a quick plug for the accountability standards and guidelines and the accountability toolkit that MenEngage, the MenEngage network, put together. And this accountability work is actually led by my dear friend and colleague Oswaldo, who you will hear speak in just a couple seconds. This is one of the only tools that I know of, and if others know of others, please do share them, that aims to put in place a set of standards on what accountable practice on the work with men and boys actually looks like, as well as an accompanying toolkit that provides practical activities on how to put those guidelines in place. And I know that there's a new version of the accountability toolkit that's actually just been released. So I encourage everyone to go and check it out. I think that's it from my end. So I think Ruya, you'll just pass it on to Oswaldo.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Jane. I'm so sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay. I'm going to unmute Oswaldo. And thank you so much, Jane. That was an excellent presentation. And you can see on your screens now Jane's email at Promundo Global in case you want to contact her. And as we'll discuss later on, you can also pose further questions to Jane and to Oswaldo on the COP platform discussion forum. So now we're going to go on to our second presenter, who is Oswaldo, who I am unmuting now. And Oswaldo, I'll just introduce you briefly, and then I'll give you control of the presentation so you can click through it at your own pace. And so please let me introduce Oswaldo Montoya, who is the Global Networks Associate at MenEngage and is currently working with the network's Global Secretariat in Washington to promote accountable practices. And Oswaldo is also one of the founders of the Men's Group Against Violence in Managua, Nicaragua, which was one of the first men's groups of its kind in Central America. And he has over 20 years of experience as an educator, an activist, a program officer, researcher, professor, consultant, and counselor who works with men and boys for gender equality. So Oswaldo, I'm going to give you control of the presentation now. And if you just click through your screen, then you can begin your presentation, please. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. It's really an honor to be part of this webinar, sharing with my friend Jane and collaborating with the UN Women Training Center, which I've been one of the users of the center and of its materials. I am going to respond to the third question that was presented at the beginning. I'm going to talk about approaches, strategies, and tools to address masculinities and engage men in training for gender equality. I'm very pleased that Jane also touches on that and gave us fantastic examples of very concrete examples of tools and exercises that we can use in training. But just for start with the approaches, let's see if I can, okay. Oops, I did it twice. How can I go back to the previous slide? Here?
There's a button down
Oops.
below. Oh, okay.
Sorry. There, correct. In terms of approaches to do training with men and boys and training masculinities, I would say that our mission statement as MenEngage, as the MenEngage Alliance, it's in some way our approach to work, to do training with men and boys and with others. It's the same approach that we use for communication work, for advocacy, and it goes along the lines of the values and principles that Jane was explaining to us, as you can read through in this slide. We definitively have a pro-feminist commitment and commitment to transform unequal power relationships and patriarchal systems. And this is the content and the framework that we use for working on trainings, on different capacity building and learning spaces with men and boys and with other actors as well. In a more specific way, I can also say that our approaches for training consider the importance of engaging men and boys along with women, girls, and people of diverse gender identities. So we promote joint activities, joint training activities. What has been coined as gender synchronized is something that we support, fully support, not to have isolated, separated, ongoing spaces just for men and boys, even though I will mention the value of some temporary moments for having only men in the room, but as a strategy, as a training strategy, we support joint activities and spaces for dialogues across differences. We also consider very important to use popular education and feminist pedagogy as a approach, as a teaching approach for working on training with men and boys that promotes critical thinking, that promotes the opportunity of men and boys to really think again about the messages, the social norms that we were taught from our childhood. Was also mentioning an important approach is to always listen, take into account, being accountable to women's rights voices and interests. And this might mean to check with female and feminist advocates any new design, any new training program that we are developing. It's very important to work with other feminist group organizations and if not to at least check with colleagues, with feminist colleagues about the content of this training. In terms of learning strategies, one way to frame it is that based on personal and direct experiences, this is very important, as the fact that we privilege starting from our direct experiences in the world, in our families, in our work, in our community. So based on that, we in these trainings, we create a space for people to reflect, for people to question privilege and power, question social norms, question their own messages that they got from childhood, question the policies that are in their workplaces, in their communities, and their countries. This is a very important piece of any training, to have an opportunity to critically reflect and question the status quo. And based on that, we can envision, we can create a space in these training spaces to envision a new society, envision new institutions, new relationships that are based on equality, on justice, on respect, on new forms of living, new lifestyles, and also envision new identities. And I am putting here as a question mark if we are promoting new masculinities or if we are even promoting something completely alternative in terms of our identities as human beings. And it's something that we can create that space. And there is no one single response to this. One important part of feminist pedagogy and popular education is that we don't deliver the truth in this training session. We create a space for different reflection, different perspectives, and for dialogues, and to create jointly knowledge and knowledge that is useful for our life. And based on that, we come to the third part, which is take transformative and collective actions. We don't only reflect and question the status quo. We don't only dream about what could be a new way of living or new society, but we also need in these training spaces to start strategizing, thinking concretely in how can we move forward, how can we take action at personal level, at family level, at institutional level, at societal level. What can we do jointly? How can we, and for MenEngage, one of the main avenues for that is the way that we organize, that we invite men and boys and other to organize, which is men, boys, women, and people of other genders, to organize through networks, creating networks in towns, in cities, in countries. That's one of the ways. So usually we always offer this opportunity to get organized in a network base, which is non-hierarchical, which is more a shared power, and that give us an opportunity to put into practice what we are envisioning as a new society. One important piece on that is that definitely we need to reach out to all social actors in communities, in countries, but one in particular that is very strategic for us to target are men in power, men who have the power to make policies and practices so that we can engage them in promoting progressive policies and practices at national, international level, at community, even at community level, and also male leaders who are already gender and social justice activists. So, for instance, our colleagues and friends within the MenEngage networks are an important subject and object of training and capacity development, because we all are still working on this. We are not done with our own process of change, and we are always learning, and we need to create spaces for male leaders also to continue growing, and trainings are a marvelous space for that. You're learning different spaces and dynamic, but in training, formal trainings give a very good opportunity for that. And also men in power, we also have to recognize men who are community leaders, service providers, who are also men leaders. It's important also to recognize the value of creating safe learning spaces, to have ground rules when we do training. Voluntary is, to the extent of possible, is very important. That means in some cases trainings are mandatory. For instance, in this context, in this area of the Me Too movement and of the denunciation of a lot of sexual abuse and sexual violence in many workplaces, it's becoming mandatory to attend training on sexual harassment, and that's great. In that case, it's not voluntary, but still, when men in this case show up in a training, you have to give some opportunity for them to move according to where they are, and confidentiality is another important aspect of these safe learning spaces, and respect. And in this, facilitators are important role models. Facilitators, leaders in a training session need to model the new relationship, the new behaviors that we are promoting, and create a very democratic space in which all voices are heard. And in these cases, for safe learning spaces is when I think it is still valid to have some homogeneous spaces. Let's say only young men in a room, to feel comfortable talking, not to have at this moment, at this early moment, not to have to be vulnerable in front of adult men or in front of women, to prepare them to spaces in which there is more heterogeneous and more diverse and more dialogues with women. Like this exercise, the fishbowl exercise that Jane was describing, is a mixed space already in which men and women are sharing. So we need two of those spaces in our training programs. And finally, picking up on what Jane was, what I wanted just to show you, Jane mentioned the last version of the accountability training toolkit. Here is the link in which you can see the toolkit. I have a couple of more slides, but I'm gonna stop here considering the time, because I've been talking for 10 minutes already. So I should stop here. You can check
No,
the tool.
Oswaldo, if you want to go on, you can go on, please.
Yeah, one more minute,
Yeah,
just to
please.
say that Jane
No, you can have a few more
was
minutes. No worries.
the main author of the first edition of this training toolkit. Now we just launched the second edition. We built on the first one. We expanded with more sessions. We have it in English, in Spanish, in Russian. It will be soon ready as well in French. And you can see here now the training toolkit has 7 sessions to work on accountability, and this training manual is more for activists, as I was mentioning before, to have a moment to reflect deeply about what accountability is for our work, for our activism. And I can show you here some specific examples of techniques used within the toolkit, within the accountability toolkit, like brainstorming about the meanings of accountability, breaking into small group discussions, to share personal experiences. And Jane also mentioned that the importance of sharing of personal experiences. In this case, personal experiences around accountability. Small group discussion to analyze, to critically reflect about the standards, because we have also, we come up with accountability standards for our network. And we want our members to reflect on those critically to see if these are relevant for their own context. And we invite our members to come up with their own local standards, using the global MenEngage standards only as a reference. Techniques like role play to show specific challenges in accountability, like when a member, a colleague, is acting in a sexist way in the work that we are doing in a community, how to challenge that, how to challenge our members, how to hold our members accountable. So we have a series of case studies and scenarios to practice that, to discuss that, and also to create skills that allow us to hold each other accountable. Also, we have in the toolkit questionnaires to promote self-awareness and discussions. I can show you one of them that is in the toolkit. This questionnaire for men, in which there are specific questions, like the one that you are reading there, like when women point out harmful male norms, attitudes, or practices, I feel personally attacked. So we give some space male leaders to reflect about these examples of situations in which our male egos and our patriarchy that are still within us show up in the room, in our relationships, and to critically reflect about that, and then to share with others, to share in a safe space with others. Thank you. I'll stop here. These are our MenEngage media outlets. My email is my name and then at menengage.org. So I'm very happy to continue sharing more with you all here and then and after the webinar.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Oswaldo. That was a brilliant presentation, as was Jane's. Can you both hear me?
You're welcome.
Okay, brilliant.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So thank you both so much for these wonderful presentations, and I think you've really shed some invaluable insights onto what we understand masculinities to be, why we understand them to be important, and how we can really address them. And we've been receiving some excellent questions from our members now, and I am just going to make a small change. I am going to switch screens so that we can look at the questions that we've been receiving. So just 1 second. Okay. Okay, can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. So the first question is from Jane, from Udayan, who asks, hi Jane, apart from the privilege walk and the paper toss activity, are there any experiential activities that you'd recommend?
Oh, there's so many. There's so many good ones, and Osvaldo, I'm sure you can think of others, but just to again plug in to the I would download the Men and Masculinities manual from the regional learning community from South and Southeast Asia. Again, if you Google it or if you go to the P4P website, you can download it there for free. There's an entire section on power and privilege. And so I think all of them there are fantastic. I'm trying to think of other activities that I really like from program. So from Promundo's program HM&D Toolkit. That's a compilation of our best practices around working not only on masculinities but on gender more broadly. So I would go to that, and then just last week we launched our Manhood 2.0 curriculum, which is an adaptation of our program H manual, but updated for the US context as well. But there's some really great gems in that one. Osvaldo, I don't know if you have others, but it's probably because I'm on the spot. I can't think of other names right now, but if you have other recommendations.
I think almost any content, you can start from the personal, you can make it experiential.
Yeah.
What we are putting as content in this training are always has a personal relevance and impact, and it's a matter of framing an open question and create a safe space for people to reflect, ask about not only what are your thoughts, but how are you feeling about this, what has been the impact in your everyday life. And so any technique is valid. That's why I always highlight the value of having great facilitators who have done their own work, who are always doing their own personal and teaching work in order to work with others.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So maybe we can go on to the second question, because I think this ties in to the same idea of activities and approaches and methods. So Fazal has a question, and he asks, what approaches and methods do you apply when you're training mixed groups? Since Oswaldo, you spoke a little bit about creating homogeneous groups, especially in the beginning. But for example, Fazal asks if you're in religious or conservative societies or a class environment gets heated when participants reference rigid religious or cultural values that may be perhaps a bit not exactly cognizant with equality and rights. So he'd like to hear your reflections on what kind of approaches you use in those kind of training groups.
Osvaldo, do you want to take? No, why don't you go ahead and I'll add in. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Sure. Here, what I mentioned in my presentation about the importance of having ground rules, it's one example why it is important at the beginning to agree on some basic principles on how to create the conversation, how to be tolerant and be also honest. I mean, we come here to this training with a standpoint, with a position. We are not neutral, and it might require some pre-work, pre-preparation for this training. Otherwise, it could go very ugly, very wrong. I mean, sometimes some of these groups are not prepared for a training. In some cases, you have to approach them in other ways, just to try to focus on the things that you agree. But in the case you have them in a training, I have had that experience sometimes. I think it is important to tell them this is what it's not try to convince them, not try to force them to adopt your views. It's just to present what we believe and why, and try to find any common ground in terms of the values that they have. And yeah, that's my thought at this moment. Not try to engage in a power struggle within a training program, for instance, and to consider strategically what is the best way to approach conservative groups. My impression is that in many cases there should be other approaches and not training for engaging with them.
Yeah, yeah, you took the words almost right out of my mouth, Oswaldo. So number one, trying to find common ground. I might also add to that, you as a trainer might want to do some preparation to better understand who you will be training, what their backgrounds are. Are there any potential key allies who you might be able to rely on as the training goes on, who would be able to voice particular perspectives that are more gender equitable in ways that you cannot? So it's often more powerful when you have that critical discussion and challenging of harmful gender norms when it comes from the group rather than from you, because as Oswaldo says, if it's you who's often the dissenter or the person who is disagreeing, it can become an awkward kind of power struggle, and you might lose the group quite quickly. I think the other thing to keep in mind is to check one's biases at the door. You yourself might, or one might have a much more secular view of the world, and oftentimes that colors our perspectives in terms of what we think is right and wrong. And much of the world does not see it that way. That we often that oftentimes spiritual and religious communities are a place where people find community, where people find connectedness, and sometimes that's wrapped into less than often kind of conservative views, but we also have to appreciate the good that kind of comes along with that as well. And then finally, that change doesn't happen in one training, but that we as trainers have to be really patient and meet participants where they are, and to be okay with that.
Definitely. These are brilliant answers. And I wonder, Oswaldo, if you can pick up on the next question by Steve, which I think has to do with this idea about whether we can add female gender activists as a prioritized group.
Absolutely, I completely agree with that. And for the next time, I would add that in the slide probably, definitely. Perhaps when I prepared these slides and I put as a prioritized group male gender activists, is because I was thinking about my own process as a male gender activist and seeing my friends and colleagues, males also, who tend to struggle, I would say, more in overcoming our patriarchal heritage and tendency because of the identity that we were raised. So being a male in these patriarchal societies create an additional challenges, I guess, to act in very more egalitarian way. And so that's why I think about as an urgency to, and also the harm that we can produce and create when we are out there in the world thinking that we are the change, renewed men working with others and with completely, blind spot with our blind spot not checked at all. So that's why perhaps I put it. But yes, I completely agree that we all need, and our female colleagues also need more spaces for self-reflection and keep working and learning. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. I agree completely. And I think you've already answered a bit of this question that's been posed by Cameron, and that one of our other audience members, Udayan, has also asked me to add to. So I'll just read out the question for both of you. What kinds of resistances do you encounter when challenging privileges around masculinities, and how do you overcome them? And Udayan adds to that, which I haven't been able to put up on the slide, but he's just sent it in, that why should men and boys give up their privilege? What's in it for me, so to speak? Yes, I know it will help them connect and be authentic, but only once they experience that that this has value. And an ability to connect doesn't seem a good enough reason for many. How do I address this? What are other reasons?
Oh, that's so interesting. And I love that. I love the challenging. Oswaldo, I'll say something quickly because I know we only have 2 minutes, and then maybe you want to add in.
I think we have another extra 10 because we started a bit late. So please take your time.
Okay. All right. I would say the two biggest challenges that I face in doing this work, and I know other colleagues do as well, is working with men who don't necessarily see themselves in positions of privilege. Some men might not, they might recognize themselves as being in situations of poverty, or they might, we see this a lot in the US actually, that a lot of white men feel actually that they should be entitled to more power rather than less, and feel that the last 8 to 10 years has sort of been kind of a backtracking of a lot of the privileges that they used to enjoy but no longer do. I'm still as a trainer, I'm still kind of grappling with this in terms of how to address that. And maybe Oswaldo, you have some good ideas, but that's just one big challenge of how to work with men who don't necessarily see themselves in privileged positions. I would say that maybe one way to address this is by, again, using those kinds of experiential learning exercises that create that safe space for reflection. The second challenge, I would say, is more with organizations who are working with men and boys, but and for example, want to include them more in maternal, newborn, and child health, or want to include men as as caregivers more broadly, and see when a man is sweeping, kind of referencing earlier my presentation, when I see a man sweeping or holding a baby, that all of a sudden gender equality has been achieved. But we know that it's much more complex than that. That same man might also be withholding the earnings that he gets, or the earnings that his partner gets, and not sharing that. Not sharing decision-making responsibilities at the household level. So I think, in our trainings with organizations, it's really about honing down on the importance of gender transformative approaches that really see the challenging of harmful power dynamics as like the heart of the intervention, and continuing through refreshers and site visits and things like that to really bring that home.
Perfect. Oswaldo, do you have anything to add?
Well, I would like to add, I completely agree with what Jane are saying. I would like to add that some other kind of resistance that we encounter when challenging privilege is how many men in these training activities start advocating or arguing about how men are also victims of patriarchy. And for instance, when we have a training on violence, on gender-based violence, on violence against women and girls, many men have a hard time just receiving that and acknowledging that, and immediately want to make the case about instances of cases in which men are or boys are also being victims of violence, which is true, which we need also to reflect to and explain. But I think for many, they can just hold the truth of the tremendous historical systemic violence exerted against women and girls, which doesn't mean that men and boys are not also victims, but I mean, there is some dynamic here that for me is a way of resistance, and not to mention other male participants in these kind of trainings in which they really are more kind of men's rights type people who want to sabotage these spaces, these learning spaces, and not take things seriously. And I mean, it's the kind of when people are in a training because they are obliged to be in a training, because they are being mandated to be in a training, and not share, are completely oblivious around this. It's a challenge for trainers to deal with these people, and it might require an additional webinar for talking about strategies for contrast that. But those are some of the challenges that we might find in resistance.
Perfect, thank you, Oswaldo. And well, we are running out of time a little bit, but maybe we can take just one more question, which is for Jane from Mike. He wants to know, does the new current tool address the general understanding on gender disparities in post-conflict settings?
Which tool? Is it the accountability toolkit?
I think so, yes.
So it doesn't necessarily look at accountability through the lens of any particular thematic area. It's much more around accountability to social justice movements more broadly, but that's a great suggestion. Oswaldo, has there been any thought as to how to include issues of accountability as it relates to that particular topic?
No, I think it's a good idea to work on that, on accountability or on specific thematic issues and approaches within the work of with men and boys. But as you say, the one that we have, the new edition that we have, it's more cross-cutting. It's more an approach and understand using accountability principles to work on any settings, on every area.
Exactly.
Brilliant, thank you. And okay, we have one final question, which isn't up on screen because Marjorie has just sent it in, but I think it's very interesting, maybe because we haven't seemed to consider this before in this webinar. She wants to know, do you get into other genders as part of the goal of addressing masculinities in training for gender equality? And do you partner maybe either Promundo or MenEngage with LGBTIQ organizations that for that theme?
Yeah, from Promundo's side. Oh, go ahead, Oswaldo.
It is for us center stage to create alliances and partnership with LGBTQ movement and people, and it's I would say it's a work in progress to go there. We question the dualistic notion of gender, male, female, men and women. We try to question and to learn more and to bring those perspectives. It's a work in progress, I would say.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Oswaldo, Jane, your answers to the questions have been absolutely brilliant. Because we unfortunately don't have much more time, we can't get through all the other questions that the audience members have been brilliantly sending in. But I don't want you all to worry, because I will post all the questions that you've asked onto the COP discussion forum. And I'll also ask Oswaldo and Jane if they have time to please visit the forum and answer questions, or maybe we can do this by email. So we can definitely keep these debates alive. And I'm just going to change the screen again. And okay, so we can go through just the next steps as we close up the webinar. And on behalf of the UN Women Training Center, I want to thank you all for your contributions, especially to Jane and Oswaldo for their brilliant presentations and for answering our questions so thoroughly. And as I've mentioned, you can continue the debates by visiting the COP platform on the UN Women Training Center's website. Now, we've had a little bit of trouble with people accessing the platform, so I just wanted to explain that the way to access is to visit the training center's portal and then to click on My Courses and then select Community of Practice. And if you aren't a COP member, you can join at any time by adding the Community of Practice to your e-commerce basket on the Training Center's website. And I don't want you to worry, it's absolutely free. So, and if you have any trouble, you can email me at ria.ligari@unwomen.org for help. And I also wanted to mention that since this webinar has been recorded, it'll be on our YouTube channel, which you can see on screen now, the address. Also, if you just type in UN Women Training Center into YouTube, it'll come up. And we will be sending all registrants, so everyone who's participated today and everyone who's been participating, who signed up for the webinar, we are going to send you all a follow-up email. And as many of you have asked in the questions, I will include the links to the toolkits that Jane and Oswaldo have mentioned today so that you can access them directly. And we're also going to be producing a final report on the virtual dialogue, and which will be available later this month on the UN Women Training Center's website later in June. So thank you very much, Oswaldo and Jane, and all our panelists and our audience members for making this webinar such a success. And we hope to see you all in the virtual dialogue platform very soon. And thank you very much. I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Ria. Thanks, Oswaldo.
Thank you both. Thank you, all the people who join us.
Thank you to all.
Thank you.